Um, Excellent. All right. Well, thank you everyone for another Ask Professionals. We've got a double session this month in two different time zones to bring in a few experts from overseas. My name is Bri Norton. I'm co-chair of OZeWAI, a not-for-profit professional organisation for digital accessibility professionals in Australia. And we're here today to discuss items around legislation and policy around Australia and around the world. And we've got some experts who I'll ask in a moment to introduce themselves. Before we get started, I'm going to do an acknowledgement of country. I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians of this land on which I'm meeting today here in Canberra, and pay respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal Nation, both past and present. And I extend this to all Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander peoples in attendance today. And feel free to put in the chat who you pay your respects to today. Maybe put your name and your role as well. And please use the chat or put your hand up for any questions. Looks like it's going to be a small crowd, so it'll be good to get the discussions going. But I might go to you, Alanna, first. If you could please do a little introduction for yourself.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Alanna. You can probably tell from the accent that, yes, I'm Australian. So I'm from the Digital Transformation Agency. So what we do is, we look at proposals for digital and ICT investments. But essentially what I do is I'm from the policy arm of the agency, and my team make policies and standards that other agencies are to follow when they're creating digital services. And my main baby is the digital service standard, or the inclusion standard, which focuses on accessibility and inclusion.
Excellent. Thanks, Alanna. And over to you, Susanna.
So hello, everyone, and good evening from Europe. So I am Susanna Laurin. I lead a independent research and innovation institution in Sweden in Europe. But I think I'm here to talk about the EU legislation and standards because I'm also chair of the ETSIS and Senelec joint technical body on e-accessibility, which is the organization or the body mandated by the European Commission to make sure that we have presumed conformance of the EU legislation. So that's what I'm doing in my day job, so to speak, and I'm also representing the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, IAAP, to the EU. So everything that has to do with the EU is usually my fault.
No, and this is why we've got you here, Susanna, because you've got such expertise across such a range of aspects. But definitely, in this case, we are going to chat about the European Accessibility Act and the impact, mainly on what that means for people in Australia and other countries. Over to you, Dr. Ann, please.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Ann Kettler. I had the privilege of serving as the Vice President for Consulting with a company called GrackleDocs. Grackle is an end-to-end digital accessibility company. And through my role as the VP for Consulting, I work with organizations and educational institutions all over the world to do things like strategically plan for digital accessibility based on whatever the current or upcoming legal standard is, but also with the understanding that access is a human right, and providing education about the social justice aspects of digital accessibility, along with the standards themselves from a more scientific perspective, and how you integrate those things. So anything from helping them understand what needs to happen so that they can best get a grasp on what their digital footprint is, and then make a strategic plan and roadmap to achieve their goals, to more granular items and looking at conformance standards, really whatever they need. If it's training, I oversee our training in North and South America and some of the UK as well, to make sure that they know how to do these things. But then also the team of consultants that we have also works to create things like digital accessibility policy based on legal standard, and anything throughout meeting that policy, what organizations are going to need. And then my background before that was in education and higher education in the United States. So I've done a lot of published research when it comes to the experience of disability in education. and I sit on a few other boards that actually create the standards by which higher education in the United States
Excellent.
needs to do their job. Um,
Yeah.
so, um, so applying digital access standards within all of those things to incorporate it in all of education in the United States is also is also very much within my wheelhouse. So ADA, state-based legislation, but then with Grackle, kind of a global reach.
That's great. And that education piece, obviously, very important here in Australia. We're actually doing some work through OZeWAI to try and get a digital accessibility apprenticeship, some research into getting what the education process is at the moment. Is that there's hardly any accessibility in our higher education, so we do need to get that revisited. But I do want to come back to some of the policy aspects, and I think we're all going to come from different regions, which is great. But I might go to Alanna first, and I have a question that I ask everyone, and it's a little bit, you've kind of told me a little bit about your role, but as you talk about the new policy that DCA has put out and the standards that follow it, Alanna, also if you could please provide a little bit around why accessibility is important to you and why it's a part of this policy, and maybe just give it a little bit more of an understanding of what this policy is about. And you're, yeah, perfect, thanks.
Yeah, sure. So, yes, I went on mute so I could have a little bit of a cough, and I have to remember to go
Okay.
take off mute. So essentially, to me, accessibility is important, particularly in the government context, simply because we do have so many government services and we have so many users of government services. So I think that's why, to me, the policy is important, because we're setting the benchmark, we're setting the standard for what agencies are required to do. And I think, those that work in the field of accessibility and those that have the specific knowledge, they're quite a passionate bunch, and that's fantastic. But not everybody has that knowledge. Not everybody understands why it's important. Not everybody, I'll be honest, I didn't know much about it until I started here. So I think, if there's a lot of me out there, there's a lot of other people out there working on these things without realizing that, accessibility is important and why it's important. And I think, so with our policy and the standards that sit beneath it, they're very outcomes focused. The previous version of one of the standards was very prescriptive, and we made it more outcomes focused. And we're finding that it's a lot easier to drive executive buy-in as well as get the practitioners on board with that, simply because we're selling the advantages of, this policy. These are what the outcomes are. These are the benefits to the users, and this is why that we're doing that. So, yeah.
No, that's great. And tell me a little bit more about the specific inclusion policy. What kind of things does it include?
So, the policy itself was crafted with a particular cohorts in mind, those most at risk of digital exclusion. So, got First Nations Australians, culturally linguistically diverse Australians, rural and remote. But essentially, the principles of the inclusion standard. I'll go backwards a little bit. I'll point out as well, the inclusion standard was also built out from a recommendation of an audit that was conducted on digital services in Australia, and one of the recommendations was to leave no one behind, and that was to ensure that everybody has access to digital government services. So this inclusion standard was built out in direct response to that, and the principles within that, there's 5 criteria, but it goes a bit deeper than just 5 criteria. We focus on ensuring that there's an omnichannel approach, because not everyone can actually access digital services. We ensure that user rights are upheld. We talk about, keeping in mind who your audience is, who the users are, so using appropriate language, using the, appropriate, things like that. So there's quite a few elements to it. I'm conscious of, I could go down this rabbit hole, but I'm conscious of how giving enough information without giving too much.
No, exactly right. And we'll be talking about and hopefully taking some questions about how to apply this, in people's work roles as well. But Susanna, if you'd like to share with us a little bit about the European Accessibility Act, and that there's going to be there's a big push already, I guess, by June 2025 to have member states, adhere to that. And what does that mean for maybe, companies or organizations in Australia? And, maybe tell us a little bit more about the background of that.
So the European Accessibility Act is quite an ambitious legislation, and I think the most important thing for people outside of the EU is that if you would like to sell your products or services in the EU, then you need to make sure that they follow the requirements, because of these, it's not like everything. We sometimes hear that, we have the public procurement or the public sector legislation already in accessibility, and now we move into the private sector, and then everything in the private sector is covered. That's not really true. This legislation is on specific certain products and services, but within, if your product and service is within this scope, then it doesn't matter where you're headquartered. So even companies or organization, it doesn't matter if you're a not-for-profit or a commercial company. If you're a manufacturer, distributor, importer, provider, service provider, whatever, no matter where you are in the ecosystem, if you would, or the value chain, if you would like to present your product or service into the EU and you are in scope of this legislation, then you need to make sure that your product or service is compliant, because otherwise there may be fines and penalties, but the end, the most important part of this legislation is that your product or service can be taken off market. So this is something that everyone who wants to sell their product or services into the EU needs to take into account. And that is huge. I mean, that's the first time the EU is doing something like this. That is not only kind of where we are, but this is really affecting everyone. So that's either scary or cool, depending on what side you're on. But at least it's a very big change in how we do accessibility in the EU. So
I was just going to say too, so and the member states, can you explain how that works? Because they enforce things differently, won't they, from June next year?
Yes. So there are 7 or 8 different ways of doing laws in the EU system. And if we just skip the ones that we don't care about and just focus on the accessibility ones, those are always directives. So if you have heard of any EU legislation ever, you have probably heard of GDPR. That's a regulation. So EU regulations are laws that cover all member states, every part of the EU in exactly the same way. So everything is the same in each corner of the EU. But the accessibility legislation, so far at least, has always been directives. And a directive, an EU directive, means that we decide something on the kind of the overall level, but then we need to transpose or implement this into each of the member states. So all the different countries need to either find, okay, we do already have a law on web accessibility, for example, and we just need to update it to meet what the EU wants us to do. So we kind of refine the existing law to meet what the EU wants us to do. Or we don't have a current legislation in our country, and then we need to develop a new one. So those are the 2 different ways to do this. And there are rather small differences. There is a kind of a flexibility here, which some people especially in the disabled community think is a weakness of the accessibility directives, that it would be, so the idea is that it would be better if it was a regulation, because it would be one size fits all and it would be the same everywhere and it's easy to implement and everything. And they have a point. So it's easier to implement a regulation. But I personally think there are good reasons for having the accessibility legislation as directives, because long before we had any common EU legislation, we had different kinds of laws in the different member states. And we have very different levels of maturity when it comes to ICT or digitalization or assistive technology provision and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of differences between the EU member states. So to me personally, I think it makes sense to have a certain flexibility. But you may have different views on this. But anyway, this is what the legislation, kind of the the ecosystem looks like, and we do see a little bit of differences. So when it comes to the European Accessibility Act, there will be differences when it comes to penalties and when it comes to the way the surveillance authorities are doing enforcement and so on. But I think the kind of the focus on the differences is kind of blurring the view a little bit, because in reality, we all have the same directive to comply to, and the requirements is in the law, and we all need to do the same thing. And then we do have a little bit of leeway to do things differently in different countries. But in reality, the minimum requirements are the same. So we all need to comply with this, and then we can do a little bit of, those are fringe things. Don't focus on that. Focus on what is actually in the legislation. That is much more important than the possible differences between Germany and Spain. I mean, that's not really what makes the difference for companies, I think. That's my personal view. I'm not giving legal advice here, because I know this may lead to two different decisions in global companies, but really just based on what the accessibility directives have meant so far, I do not think that the differences between the member states will be the big issue here.
No, that's great. Yeah, good summary. Thank you very much. And Anne, what do you think is happening in the States? There's some other legislation there that's impacting this as well. Can you share a little bit more of a background of what's happening there that could impact companies from globally from across the world?
Absolutely. So in the US, the most recent form of legislation has come down in the updates to Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Title II of the ADA specifically reaches towards public areas of accommodation. So that would be areas that receive government funding, which is more broad than you might think. So in addition to government agencies, it would also extend past to smaller aspects of government agencies, health organizations, how people receive healthcare, how they receive like food provisions, in addition to things like public four-year colleges and universities, public community colleges, public libraries, public police force, fire departments, public transit agencies. Even if they might be a privatized company, if they're a large transit agency, they're still a public transit agency. And so the reach is quite vast. And that would also then reach to anyone who is a contractor or providing any work for those agencies. So if you contract with any government agency or organization within the United States, if you contract with any public university or public community college, library, any of those other areas where they receive some aspect of government funding, then in order for them to continue to contract with you, to continue to use any product or service that has a digital component or an online web-based or app-based component, you would also need to become in compliance or to conform to the updates in ADA Title II. And those updates specifically are towards the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.1 at the AA level. Which, and this, to Susanna's point as well, there's a lot of similarity across the laws just globally, and the vast majority of them link back to WCAG. Some link back to WCAG 2.0, some are 2.1. Even though we are at 2.2, I haven't seen any yet that mention the 2.2 standard, but really 2.1 and 2.2 are incredibly similar. And in the US, Title II, it comes with specific deadlines, which I think is really important. And frankly, this is the first legislation that this country has seen that is an overarching or federal piece of legislation that speaks to digital access. We've obviously had the Americans with Disabilities Act in place since 1990, and before that section, or the Rehabilitation Act of 79. But this is the first specifically calling out digital access, which for us is frankly a long time in coming. And a really important statement that the Department of Justice Office of Civil Rights is making, because this is a call to action. And the deadlines are quite short, if you ask me. It depends on the population that you serve as one of those government-funded entities. So if you serve the population around you based on the most recent United States decennial census. If it's 50,000 people or more, then they had 2 years to comply. So that means that their
Wow.
deadline is April 24th, 2026, which means for any entity that contracts or provides any sort of resources or services that are digital or app-based for those organizations, they also would need to be in compliance with WCAG 2.1 at the AA level no later than April 24th, 2026. At that point, if they are not, technically, those organizations can no longer use their services because they cannot put anything online or require the use of something that is known to be inaccessible that does not meet that standard in order to receive a product, good, or service that that organization provides. And then if you are a smaller population serving organization, so if it's less than 50,000 people based on your most recent decennial census, then they had a 3-year turnaround, which still isn't a lot of time.
No, it's not.
But
Very quick.
their deadline,
Yeah.
it's quite short, really, when you think
Yeah.
about the vastness, even just in one organization, of how much online content there are, whether that's built in to the actual code of the website itself, whether it's the different pieces of content that are uploaded and available within the website, other third-party software programs that are integral to processes that you need to use the website or online-based processes in order to receive a product, a good service.
Yeah.
I think about even just in education alone, whether that's a public K through 12 or education system, that applies to them too. So not just higher education, but primary and secondary education as
Yeah.
well. If you imagine how many classes are online,
Yeah.
this extends through to those individual courses, which was part of the debate when the proposed changes for rulemaking initially went out for this change. There was a lot of outcry and individuals within the disability community wanting the standard to be enforced even within an online course environment,
Yeah.
which is what the government did.
Excellent. Yeah.
Which is
It's good.
sometimes terrifying, depending
Yeah.
on where you sit. However, I frankly think it's fantastic. It's a lot of work to do. When you think about just how many documents and processes and softwares, and think about, if you're a publishing company, if you're anyone connected with publishing and you can hear the sound of my voice, whether you're going to be providing product for the United States or in the EU, in Australia, if you are not providing something that's going to meet whatever specific legal standard or digital accessibility standard that the law is pointing to in your area, then it is very likely that your published materials and resources will not be able to be used if they are online or web-based, which is huge.
Yeah.
Think about learning management systems.
Yeah. So just on that, and so in Australia, the Alanna just confirmed with me, I think the digital service standard is now to the latest WCAG. It actually has that wording of which to us is 2.2, and it aligns now with EN 301549, which has also taken on the 2.2 as well. So Alanna, is that correct? It says the latest standard.
Yeah, so actually in the digital service standard, it's quite interesting. So we don't actually specify a version of WCAG. And the reason for that is we didn't want to date the standard. And funnily enough, the latest version of WCAG came out literally like a month after we went live with our standard. So we've got the Australian Public Service Commission, it's another government agency, they've got the style manual and they outline the latest version and what the latest version to be compliant with is. So while we would love for agencies to be using, 2.2, essentially, so we refer to the style manual. So we direct agencies on to what the style manual have dictated as being the latest version, essentially. And we discovered that most agencies were using AA as well, were AA compliant. There are some agencies doing really well and they're AAA compliant, and it's great for them, but not all agencies are able to do that. So that's why we've settled on the most recent.
Yeah. So there's someone that's not just calling out the 2.0 or 2.1. I'm going to go to you, Susanna, for a question from Ricky, because this kind of relates a little bit about how do you balance the need for international harmonization of legislation and standards with respecting individual national and cultural requirements or expectations. And you're probably doing that a lot across the EU anyway. But what do you see as that harmonization that needs to happen?
Well, that's really a question for either the European Commission or the European Courts of
Yeah.
Justice. But but if you ask me as a person, I'm not the one deciding this, obviously. But I think the way the EU has done this by making sure that the accessibility legislation are all directives, and making sure that the transposition is done in kind of a good way. I think that is the balance that we have come up with. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think it's quite clever or well working, because it's kind of we have a minimum requirement for users, but we also have the reality on the ground. Some Slovak languages, so in the east of Europe, where Android doesn't have voiceover for all languages, for example. So assistive technology provision, what was back in my town called accessibility supported. So what is happening after the interface is actually accessible, but
Yep.
then the client-based assistive technology needs to take over. So if that doesn't work, then accessibility is completely pointless. So we need to make sure that whatever we do at the EU level works at member state level. Otherwise, it's kind of pointless. So I think that is exactly where we need to make this balance work. And I am famously or infamously one of the persons who said that I don't think legislation will help us. Here we are. I'm 95% of my working life these days are around the legislation in Europe. So that's the irony of being not thinking legislation would be the thing. But unfortunately, I think I was right in one piece. That is that the countries that are very mature in accessibility, they are actually moving backwards with the legislation. What I maybe didn't expect, or what I didn't realize, and what the others was right in, was that member states that are very new to accessibility or not that mature, they do move forward. So the legislation does make accessibility kind of higher up on the agenda, so to speak. So it does make a real difference, and I do see that. So I was probably wrong, but what I do see is also that some of the countries that used to do accessibility for the right reasons, quote unquote, so really making sure that as many people as possible can use the information of the service, these days point more to exactly what do we need to do to meet these requirements, and that in reality that means moving backwards. So I think that is where we need to, we being the accessibility community or professionals, need to keep pushing forward, so that the mature countries don't stop evolving and stop making things better for people with disabilities, but keep being the front runners, and then still making sure that what is good in the legislation, which is the immature countries, the countries where accessibility hasn't been happening without legislation, that they kind of catch up with the rest of the crew. I think that is kind of the most important thing happening in the days, in the years moving forward, to make sure that we align more, at least in Europe, and hopefully in the rest of the world as well, between countries that are already doing accessibility in a good way, and the ones that are very new to the topic.
It's a good point. It's about that balance, isn't it? The stick and the carrot. Trying to encourage people, or trying to enforce. And I think it comes down to an enforcement question here as well. And I think, Anne, if you'd like to share just a little about that harmonization in America. I mean, there's more likely of organizations being sued in America. We don't have that in Australia. So that kind of stick aspect is a little bit different. What do you think this legislation is going to do to that? Is that going to build that up more? You're going to see that kind of difference in balance of those that are trying to do something well, trying to keep up, and yeah, what do you see changing there?
Sure. Well, America is known, and not incorrectly, for being far more litigious than many
Yeah,
other countries. And so, frankly, I think this provides even more fuel to the fire,
yeah,
if to use a turn of phrase. Even before ADA was updated, there were tens of thousands of digital accessibility lawsuits within the United States every year, and that number had been growing exponentially. And in every instance of a digital accessibility and a disability discrimination claim that went through the Department of Justice Office of Civil Rights for investigation, if most of the time there was either a settlement or resolution agreement that was achieved. In other words, there was no actual quote unquote finding of guilt or innocence. Instead, the parties agreed to resolve their conflict or
yeah,
settle, and then go into really a plan that the government oversaw for what they needed to do to become fully digitally accessible. That plan always referred back to the WCAG standard, whichever was the most recent at the time. And so this law really just makes that what was really truly a legal interpretation already from the Department of Justice. It makes it a black and white standard
yeah,
in print now. So I think it really just provides additional fuel. Also, with the WCAG or with the ADA Title II updates, in order to file suit, you do not need to be a person with a disability who is directly affected by the lack of digital access in a particular area.
interesting.
You could be anyone and choose to file suit. That is different than some of the state-based standards. So here we have in Colorado, there's something called HB 21, which is very similar in terms of the compliance requirements. It does cite WCAG, in this case 2.1 at the AA level, but it has some additional requirements towards just basic digital documents, even those not found on a website or app. And for Colorado, it's again based on government-funded organizations within the state, but its deadline is July 1 of 2025. So about 8 months from right now.
Yeah,
And so again, that's that state, that law, when that deadline passes, you do have to be a person with a disability that is directly affected
right.
by the barrier or lack of access. So really, it just opens the door for more digital accessibility complaints
Yeah,
that can come forward through legislation, because now it is in black and white, and it didn't take it takes it above the level of what we would consider case law, which is based on the different areas within the country that level of Supreme Court sits.
yeah,
So now it's at the federal level, and everyone must comply. It's not based on a lower level court to interpret whether or not an environment, quote unquote, because it says the environment must be proactively accessible in the ADA. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean a brick
yeah,
and mortar environment, or does that mean also a digital environment? In terms of interpretation for digital access lawsuits, both public and private, the Department of Justice has consistently interpreted that to mean brick and mortar and digital. Well, now we
excellent.
have a law
Yeah,
in place that specifically for government-funded organizations puts it in writing. So I
yeah,
think honestly, it really just adds fuel to the fire, which is in part, I think, why many organizations that receive that type of funding in the United States are doing everything they can and quickly to try to achieve the highest level of conformance possible within that deadline time, because they realize that legally they could certainly become into hot water. I wish that it was happening, because frankly, this is simply the right thing to do.
yeah.
Um, but unfortunately, when you live in a very litigious country, sometimes this is how you
It
actually
takes
get the
some
needle to
time.
move. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think for Alanna, enforcement. So we have a policy, we have these standards. Are there timeframes? What kind of enforcement is there for those in Australia that need those federal? And I take it it's mainly federal, state don't have to apply. How does that work?
So yes, so you are correct. So it is for federal agencies. So I will also point out as well, it is predominantly for, we've got non-corporate Commonwealth entities as well as corporate Commonwealth entities. So there's the digital experience policy as a whole with 4 standards underneath it. Now, the service standard, that has a different effective date to the other standards because it was the first cab off the rank in terms of development and implementation. Unfortunately, we weren't resourced enough at the time to have them all roll out at the same time. So it's a bit complicated for agencies with when that kicks in. But essentially, so the digital service standard is in effect. And then the other standards come into effect from the 1st of January next year. So in terms of enforcement, we learned our lesson previously with the digital service standard that it already existed, that came about in 2016, and it received a much needed facelift last year. And while it is mandated, previously it was very much a case of this is a standard you need to follow. It's mandated, off you go. Whereas now, lessons learned, it's very much a case of we understand that agencies need help. They need help understanding what the standard is. They need help with understanding how to apply it. And we've been, as I mentioned earlier, we've been selling that by driving the benefits of, what it means to users. So in terms of enforcement, we've taken the carrot approach rather than being the stick. The stick is the fact that it is mandated, that they are required to follow it because there is compliance reporting required. However, the carrot is very much us providing guidance documents, having one-on-ones with agencies, doing lots of presentations and workshops and understanding what it is that agencies need assistance with. And, the digital government landscape in terms of the agencies, some are huge, some have lots of money, lots of resources, some are small, some don't have lots of money or resources. And, it's been very important for us to understand the varying challenges that these agencies face. So when it comes to enforcement and, assisting agencies with doing that, it is quite different for each one, really.
Yeah, and I think there's also that aspect that it is a policy now, so they can actually put that into their policies to link back to as they're doing their risk analysis or anything around their digital products and services, and that's an education approach. Now that's really good to hear. It would be nice to have a little bit more of a stick, I think, in some ways, but it's a bit hard for us to do that in Australia, and I know even the accessibility community would like to see more of that, and that's what OZeWAI is here for, to help advocate for you as well, Alanna, and for detailing what you're doing. And we thank you for being here. Now, Steve has got a question in there, I think, and I think Susanna, I'm not sure if you can see the question about selling visas online to Europeans who travel to Australia. Does that kind of count as a something that needs to be regarded under the European Accessibility Act? I would think so.
Yes, it does. I tend to always say that I am not giving legal advice, but but yes, that as far as I understand, that would be covered under e-commerce, because if you try to sell something to consumers, so private persons, online in Europe, that is e-commerce. The e-commerce is very broadly described in the Accessibility Act. So even if you have a physical shop and you do sell some things online, that's still e-commerce. So this, I think, would definitely be covered under the Act. Yes.
Yep, and something to be considered. Thank you. I hope that answers your question, Stephen, and Ricky, your question from earlier about the harmonisation. I hope we've answered that one as well. If we haven't, just put your hand up and we can have a chat. Daniel's asked, and I think this is more maybe for you, Alanna, around the Australian Digital Inclusion Standard. Does it cover any organisation that receives public funding? I'm actually really quite interested in this and seeing how this plays out, because we see a lot of NDIS providers are doing a lot of things around promoting their digital accessibility, unfortunately with overlays, and they're funded by the government. So why are they allowed to do that? That should be a check on them, right? To make sure that they make their services accessible as well. How can we, do they apply to them, the NDIS providers and other public funding?
So it's an interesting question. So I don't really know how, okay, so it is an interesting question. So essentially, in a nutshell, no, it does not apply to them. The policy and standards apply only to the non-corporate Commonwealth entities. There is one other standard that applies to corporate, but that won't come into effect until 2027, but 2026. But to answer your question, so for example, there are certain agencies, and we have had these conversations with them. They use third parties for their websites and apps and things like that. So their question to us was, if they were to outsource that work, would the agency creating the website or app need to follow the standard? And the answer to that is yes. So while it would not apply to that entity, the thing is, if you're getting a third party to make a beautiful website for you, but it's got your name and your logo and your organization on it, as in the government agency, then you're still on the hook for that. So while it doesn't apply to the organisation who is creating the website on behalf of the government agency, it is still up to the government agency to ensure that whichever third party they go through is compliant with the policy and standards, because, as I said, they're on the hook for it.
Excellent. No, that's good to know, and I think that's somewhere that I'm going to ask a question about how OZeWAI works as well, but maybe we can provide more guidance for some of those organizations or those agencies that are not aware of what they should put in their requirements. But yes, Susanna, unfortunately they are, and they're targeting small business, these providers who are helping providing support for disability organizations, and they're selling their products to say we fix it, and they don't know any different. So we're trying to put some material and information around that to kind of have a go at those myths that are coming through, and share with these small businesses to say there's other ways to do that. So yes, it's very unfortunate, and we're in a situation where unlike the US, there's no I know there's a lot of these overlays are getting sued. Unfortunately, they're selling themselves here as accessibility widgets. So we're going to start doing some campaigning around accessibility widgets and not call them overlays, starting to talk their language as well and see how we go. But yeah, it's unfortunate. All right, so I'm going to go to a question that I'd like to, that this is digital accessibility. OZeWAI is we're a career professionalization. How do you see the changes with these legislation and policies in the need and the growing, career opportunities basically for digital accessibility professionals? Susanna, would you like to go first with that? Are you seeing a kind of a change in education, and or what do you or what are the challenges then around education for digital accessibility professionals?
I wish I could say yes. Still from in the EU, the vast majority of universities and higher education and also vocational training institutions are not providing accessibility as part of their curriculum. IAAP and many other organizations together with us are trying to change this. It takes, I don't know, it's like changing a super tanker. I don't know why higher education universities are so difficult to change, but it takes time to get this in, and that means that we are every year we see new generations of UX designers, graphical designers, content managers, developers, whoever web professional comes out of education, and they have a lot of good knowledge, but they don't know shit about accessibility. And then the whole community needs to kind of audit and test and remediate, and that's where we kind of all of us are working backwards. So it's just it's a nightmare. We haven't made a big change in Europe. I think IAAP, the professional certification and the way we do training is trying to change that. It still takes time. I see a small change maybe in specifically in vocational training, but unfortunately I don't see the big change happening yet. But we actually need to do that. What we do see is a lot of more companies, small companies popping up with the new legislation, especially, and the vast, I mean, the enormous demand we see in for expertise. But what I see most of, or what we see most of, is kind of expert companies and people really being experts in accessibility, and that is fantastic, and I love that. But what I think society needs most is not that. It's really not the experts. It's the general ICT, the generic ICT companies that sell any ICT to anyone, knowing the basics of accessibility. And that we haven't really seen that change happening yet. We do see people who were usability experts in, day one, and in day two, they are called accessibility experts. So how did they get that training in one day?
Yeah.
Not really sure, but so we see that the market demand is there, but we don't really see actual hands-on knowledge and experience changing as quickly as the market demand. I mean, obviously, but there's something is happening in the market, and I mean, I'm kind of a dinosaur in this, and I see there is so much more people doing this, and so many more young people wanting to work with accessibility. So I'm very positive and optimistic about the future. We haven't seen kind of the tip of this yet, but
Yeah.
I think we're kind of moving there. So in a couple of years, I think we will see a really big change. I'm positive.
Yeah, look, I'm with you. I'm going to be positive as well. I just put a link in a chat to the latest update that we did after some workshops with the Future Skills organisation that is addressing digital gaps here in Australia, and they're looking to put more of the digital accessibility into the curriculum, the school curriculum. So there'll be more workshops for that. So anyone on the call or anyone listening to the recording later, please register if you hear some of these workshops coming up. And Alanna, maybe that's something we can partner with DTA, getting those kind of education approach. What about you? Annie, you've seen a change in, how busy are you? Are you seeing a change? I know there's, David Fazio is doing some great work over there in digital accessibility, professional apprenticeships and things like that. So to try and build it into, like a software development approach. UK is doing that. We'd like to do it here. What are you seeing as well in the change in expertise and the quality and the consistency of accessibility professionals?
Yeah, absolutely. So to answer the question, am I busy? Yes, quite. And GrackleDocs as a company is incredibly busy. And like I said earlier, we're end-to-end digital accessibility. So we handle everything from remediation of content to training to human auditing and user testing and consulting. And then we also have different softwares that aid in digital accessibility editing and creation. So we're very busy. Specifically in our North American, with our North American audience. In terms of what I'm seeing as a whole across this country, there's a desperate need to understand what the standards mean and how to apply them. And I think that speaks to Susanna's point because we have great computer engineering departments in higher education, and very few of them have started to integrate the updated legal requirements into the curriculum. The institutions of higher education here have been historically more mindful about accessibility. So that's something that we have kind of going for us, if you will. So they're also beginning to make strides towards digital accessibility. And while that is a fantastic thing, that's happening from an organizational level, not from an educational standpoint or a curriculum or pedagogy standpoint. And so what I think is really necessary is for those two things to align, because when we look at what's going to change the broad community, that's what we need. We need individuals who can, at a dev level, create that accessible content or create those accessible software programs or websites. But then it's also understanding, because there's a deadline associated with the ADA updates to Title II. Organizations, government organizations, educational organizations, and everything in between that receives that type of government funding, many of them are struggling to understand what the standard now means and how to do it. So it's really a skill set for not just disability professionals to fully understand WCAG 2.1 AA, but also to have a really in-depth understanding of the type of agencies that they may work with and the needs of those agencies, because I think it really comes down to the ability to strategically plan for digital access, and allow them to align the needs that are happening right now in terms of the new legal standard with their current strategic plan, their mission, because all these things truly do connect. There is return on investment, if you will, in addition to the fact that this is simply the right thing to do and that we get to remove systemic barriers that have been in place for decades. And in the United States, disability rights are civil rights. So this becomes a true civil rights issue in the United States, which is the other reason that there is such weight behind it.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of disability professionals and digital access professionals, what they need is a really in-depth understanding of the standard, how it can happen, but then also, and this is where they, I think, often lack, and probably is why I'm so busy, but an understanding of that planning and assessment piece, because
Yeah.
it's such a short time frame, and organizations are trying to do this. They want to achieve conformance, but they're trying to do this in a way that's going to be sustainable and efficient, and also financially manageable, because it's such a quick turnaround time.
And
So
it's not just
that's
like it's not like just getting someone in quickly to fix it. You actually want to upskill people. You want to train people. You
right.
want to make it ingrained and embedded, don't
Right.
you?
Like this
So
should be part of your job description, no
exactly,
matter what
exactly.
job you have at any organization. How are we building in, and I would challenge private entities to do this as well, even though the law does not
Yeah.
yet reach to them. There's already planned and proposed changes to rulemaking to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act in the United States that would affect digital access requirements for private organizations and agencies as well. But this needs to be in your job descriptions, not just in
Yeah.
your IT job descriptions. This needs
Needs to
to
be
be
all of them.
in
Comms,
all of them.
marketing,
Right, marketing,
HR.
communication.
Yeah.
If you're applying to be an administrative coordinator, administrative assistant, you better understand how to create an accessible Word document and PDF and how
Yeah.
that relates. It needs to be truly integrated. And it's how do you do that? Because what we want is a sustainable digital accessibility approach, not something that's coming in with a Band-Aid to try and fix it in the moment
Yeah.
and then without thinking about the future. So that's, I think, the skill set that is sometimes lacking in disability professionals who would be engaging the environment now within these new standards.
Yeah, no, exactly right. And I think it fits to a question here that Tracy's put in the chat about do you see a time when internal digital accessibility, particularly within government agencies, will match their external accessibility? I think this relates to that. And maybe Alanna, where we're in Australia, where that's our next step is internal processes and procedures as well. System and document accessibility doesn't seem to fall under the requirements. Alanna, can you share if it does come under that? Is it internal systems as well? But I mean, you want to hire people with disability, right? It's got to be an environment for working that they feel comfortable in.
Yes, so the service standard and the inclusion standard do both actually apply to staff-facing services. So they apply to new staff-facing. So we were actually going to include existing.
That's interesting.
Facing.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did want to include existing staff facing, but I'm sure you can imagine there are a lot of legacy technology. There's a lot of legacy technology and old outdated systems out there. And essentially a big thing that we heard from agencies was that was going to essentially cost them a fortune to retrospectively refit all of their existing staff-facing services. Though I will point out, given the amount of legacy technology, a lot of that is due to expire in the coming years anyway. So while we really wanted to die on that hill and ensure that include it, make sure that existing staff-facing services were in scope, instead we thought, all right, we'll listen to the feedback, we'll make sure it's only new staff-facing, and we will just wait until all the other stuff sort of, dies out, the old technology is outdated and new stuff comes in.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that comes down to your third parties as well. Like if you're getting systems and you're doing some procurement, and it comes into a question here that Steve's put in about the overlap with AS EN 301549, which is the accessible ICT procurement standard, which is different to the digital service standard, which is about building products and services. They don't necessarily overlap sometimes, but they should. So, if you are customizing a procured product, you should be applying the digital service standard in how you customize that product. And I think from our side, Steve, keep an eye out for the Australian Human Rights Commission update to the advisory note that's due to come out hopefully before the end of the year. I think it will cover those two aspects and align them a little bit more as well. But yes, Susanna, you have your hand up. You have something to say against that as well, with the procurement standards?
Yeah, no, I'm just no, it's just one thing that people tend to forget, or maybe is not that well known, that the Accessibility Act actually also affects or impacts the procurement directive. So there is an EU-wide procurement directive, and that was updated in 2017, where we moved from when possible, you should take people with disabilities into account, to now it says, since 2017, it says when the procured is going to be used by natural persons, which means human beings, then accessibility requirements shall be taken into account. So the whole when possible, which is a very kind of fluffy thing that anyone can just forget. But now it's, if it's going to be used by actual humans, then you need to take this into account. So that's a big thing. And also in Article 42, it says that when there is a new European a law in the European Union that points to specific technical specifications, those are the ones that you are going to use. So that's a bit, it has been kind of a little bit under the radar, I think. But this is it's a big thing for public procurers and for anyone else. I mean, big companies like banks and other large commercial organizations who voluntarily use the procurement rules for when buying things. So, and this is really a big change, and also a shift when it comes to the EU institutions, which are, funnily enough, for people outside of the EU, not covered by the directives. But now we have a financial regulation that says exactly the same thing, verbatim, as the procurement directive. So even the Parliament and the Commission and all the other EU institutions needs to follow the same regulations. And this is just makes common sense, that when you buy ICT, then you should also make sure that they are accessible according to exactly the same rules as all the other EU legislations. So this, I think, will also make a big change. It will be more of a silent revolution than the Accessibility Act in itself, but it will also make sure that procurers, with all their enormous purchasing power of the public sector in the EU, I mean, that's absolutely huge. When they start making sure that whatever they buy, even if it's a computer or a website or a audiovisual media, something, ebook, whatever ICT it is, that needs to be accessible, that will make a huge change. So people focus on kind of each company. Well, what does this company do to meet the requirements? That's important for that company, absolutely. But if you kind of if you look a little bit ahead and think about the societal level, I think the procurement is a much more valuable change maker in all of this. So there are kind of two strands of the accessibility legislation happening right now at the EU level that will make a lot of change for all organizations who want to make business in the EU.
No, I agree. And I think that's a big part of what we hope to see with the Human Rights Commission in Australia, our updated advisory note, which we hope to see very soon. A lot of the accessibility community were involved in that. We can come back to your the aspect of that in a moment, Steve. But I am going to go on to a couple of other questions about the legislation and policy, and what do you see as some of the ways that organisations can do a risk analysis approach to managing this? You know, they've already got competing priorities at the moment. You know, they've got budget limitations. They've got all those kinds of things. How do you see you know, some of the clever ways that people are actually bringing in to understand these changes? And I guess I'll go to you, Anne, because you're working with businesses as well in how to you know, develop policies that are aligned to this. Are they doing something that's innovative and clever that you know others could learn from?
Sure. I think some organizations are doing that. It's something that I work with a lot of my clients on, and that's kind of doing a gap analysis, if you will, or a SWOT analysis in terms of specifically what sector are they in, what client base or community base are they working in? But then also, what are those pain points? So what exists that might need to exist, and if so things like, do you have a digital access policy? If you do, what does it contain and what does it contain? Is it something that's been written that might actually put you at risk, or is it something that's
Yeah.
providing you a legal safe zone or risk mitigation? What about your procurement policies and your contracting policies? Do those include requirements for digital access, and how could they? Do you have in place kind of a succession plan because there's a deadline involved? What would that look like? What sort of communication plan has already been developed with your agencies that you contract with, those third parties? Things like conformance standards that are being used, doing interviews with stakeholders within the organization to say,
Yeah.
hey, how much training is provided? Do you have access to it? What is your control? What is within this division? Who controls the content that's being put out? What level of control do you have over that content? To really get an idea of the digital footprint and who sits as like an initiative owner, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then also to take that information, I'm a huge proponent of human auditing. It's something that GrackleDocs does, where we have actual humans that go in and audit sites to give someone a real picture. And so it's doing those things like finding those gaps and then aligning where we're looking for those gaps with aspects that are going to affect any and all individuals that need to use those programs, goods, or services. So not only are these going to affect individuals with disabilities, and here's how and why, because part of that assessment really also needs to include user testing or actual users, individuals with lived experience of disability, to provide information, kind of nothing with us,
Feedback and
nothing for
iterate
us
on it.
without us,
Yeah, exactly.
right?
Yeah.
So that really has to be integral. And when you have that information, even if it's anecdotal or qualitative, and you can provide that in and align it with the existing mission of the organization, with the existing strategic plan, so that they can see where by doing these things, they're actually already supporting the initiatives that they've been championing all along.
Yeah.
How can that align and build it together? Because it's also, I think, really important to provide a perspective shift. Many times when any organization is confronted with a new legal standard that requires change, it is easy for them to see that standard as a burden or a requirement, or and that does not create buy-in. It does not move any process forward any faster. However, if you do that SWOT analysis, if you're doing that gap analysis to figure out where the largest areas of lack of access exist from a digital perspective, and you can then communicate here by doing these 20 things first, you're going to increase your accessibility 80%. And by doing that,
measure
here's
it.
how it's
Exactly.
going to affect all of your users. Here's how it's going to affect your users with disabilities. And here's why this is important, because this is a human rights or a civil rights issue. And so in the US, because it's a civil right, if I go to someone and I say, here's this gap analysis that I've done, and if I simply say, okay, that means you have to do ABC now, so I need you to go ahead and do it, I'm going to get a lot of pushback, even though that might be what the law says, because they're busy. They have other requirements. They're being pulled in 10,000 directions. If I can align that gap analysis with what they've already been championing, what they already understand is something that is a return on investment, something that is worth focusing on, and I can help them change that perspective to simply saying, we have an opportunity to support the civil and human rights of an entire population, but I can't do it without you. I need you to align and collaborate with me. Together, if we use this information that we now have, we can remove systemic barriers that have been in place for decades. Would you partner with me so that we can take this opportunity to increase our reach 100-fold? That's a lot harder to say no
You
to.
make it It is
very
exactly,
different.
and it's the benefits, isn't it? Right, you've still got to have the benefits and show that, because other people revisit their strategies all the time as new rules and regulations or legislation or policies come in. This is no different. They just need to understand where it fits in those kind of priorities. Alanna, how are you helping organisations in any federal organisations? I know you've said some training. The guidance that's up there is great. Even us as accessibility consultancies are using that to help do assessments for organisations as well. Are there self-assessments again at the moment, or is it just more the kind of proactive information that's going out there? And yeah, Susanna, we'll come back to you as well to see what kind of you're seeing as approaches to making these changes. And what you're seeing as some good ones as well. Alan, did you want to go first?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So, as Anne said, so gap analysis is a good place to start. So, essentially, it has been a bit of both. So, particularly with the service standard, because it already existed and we gave it a refresh, agencies were fretting about meeting the new version. And I was like, well, there's really only a few new additions in this new version. You would have, if you were meeting the old version, you shouldn't be panicking about meeting the new one because there's only a few new things in there. So it was essentially about having them take stock of what they were already doing, which criteria in the old version they were already meeting, which criteria they will now need to, gear up for in the new standard, essentially. And it's the same with the inclusion standard as well. There was an accessibility component of the service standard. So when we brought out the inclusion standard, even though it is a deeper dive and there's more criteria and there's more things that they need to be doing, if they were ticking the box in terms of accessibility with the service standard, they should be in good stead to be doing the inclusion standard. So
it aligns already, doesn't it? Right?
Exactly. Exactly. So it's very much a case of, as I touched upon earlier, agencies are all unique in their own way. Some are informational, some are transactional, some are huge, some are very tiny. So it was very much a case of us working with each individual agency with their concerns to be like, okay, what are you concerned about? Is it applying it to your transactional service? And why are you concerned? Is it because you haven't been doing it so well in the past? Is it because you need executive buy-in? Is it because you don't have enough resources at the practitioner level? So there really hasn't been a one-size-fits-all approach. So we've taken a bit of we've taken a big approach to this. We've got guidance materials. We've been working individually with agencies. I feel like it's very much a case of how long is a piece of string.
Yeah, exactly. And just to everyone in the chat, I have just put in there, like, if you want to do a stretch, it's been over an hour. Usually I'm supposed to do this at 3/4, halfway through. So I do apologize. I was just so into the discussion. And don't forget to put any other questions that you have in the chat. So Susanna, what about you? What are you seeing as some of the ways that people are managing to meet those deadlines that are coming up in the EU?
Well, I'm kind of happy because when we are now we're really fast approaching the Accessibility Act, but even like a year ago or so, I saw a big difference when I compared just being kind of preparing for the Accessibility Act when it comes to the Web Accessibility Directive, where all the accessibility community said that, well, the public procurers and the public sectors, they are so much more kind of in the front row, or they are front runners, trailblazers for accessibility and so on and so forth. But I didn't really see that happening. I mean, we talked about accessibility for a long time and we were discussing with the member states and so on. And then all of a sudden on the 23rd of September in 2018, they go, wow, what happened? They all woke up and the day after the law entered into force or was made applicable in the member states. And they say, why didn't anyone tell us about this? And we go, well, we tried to tell you the last 5 years or something. So it was a little bit of a surprise to me that so many of them seemed so kind of waking up the same day. And now I see, I mean, since a couple of years back, at least the mid-sized and large organizations in the commercial sector, they are very much extremely interested, and they're asking for more information and more training and so on. So we're doing, my whole team has been doing trainings, webinars, and
These.
consultancies on access. We are so tired of this legislation. I can't tell you. I mean, I don't know the words in English on how to tell you how tired we are of this. It seems like, at least I'm absolutely sure that there are small companies that still have no clue, and they don't know that they're in scope of this, and they have never heard of accessibility. I'm sure that's also happening, but at least the mid-sized companies and the larger companies, they are really aware, and they are trying their best to prepare for the legislation. I'm quite sure of that. And it's not just us. I mean, the whole market is kind of blowing up with demand of this. So that is kind of rewarding in one way. So we feel that accessibility is now high on the agenda. On the other hand, we still see people not really understanding why, or not understanding the user perspective of this, and just doing it because either it's the right thing to do, or because somebody tells them to do it, and still not really getting it, why this is important, and why we're doing it. So it's really moving, and I'm positive, and I think the Accessibility Act will actually change things. But we still have to be there and make sure that people don't make stupid decisions, and don't believe in snake oil sales of overlays and so on. So
yes, exactly.
There's a lot still out there for the accessibility community to agree on, and make sure that we just are professional enough to fight all these misconceptions of all of this. But I'm still hopeful. I think I hope that the EU will keep doing things our way, and not going in the kind of litigation direction that the US has chosen, because I think there are a lot of differences. I'm not saying one thing is better than the other, but I do think that kind of in the legal tradition that we have in the EU, is more of supporting and trying to solve things than suing people. And I think we can get a long way there before trying the US way. And I also think that really making people aware can really change things. And I think we have seen that already with the Web Accessibility Directive, where many public sector authorities didn't have a clue, and just having the feedback mechanism with actual end users with disabilities telling them that I cannot reach this information, I have no clue what this service is about, that has made the big change. So I think, I mean, that's not really scalable or kind of the solution to everything, but really every time that happens, that's just the kind of the change of the human mind that I think we all need to succeed in this.
No, that's great. And thank you, Alanna, for answering Steve's questions. I know you've got some wonderful a breakdown of criteria on the website for the digital experience and the standards there to actually for people to self-assess, or organizations to self-assess. We're using that for assessments as well with other clients. But and look, I'm just going to touch on what you said about the community, the accessibility community itself, and kind of and what do you think? I mean, how do you think OZeWAI is we're a Australian community. We also have obviously connections globally. We understand that there's organisations, IAAP. Some of our members are also members of IAAP and do certifications. What kind of things do you think we can best support accessibility specialists to understand what's happening with these accessibility legislation and policy across the world? What kind of things should we be developing as professional development for experts, so that they can learn more and share that with organizations? And I know you gave us a gap analysis, but what specific skills would you think we should be targeting?
Sure. So first, in terms of just making sure that the accessibility expert is well versed in the newest legal standard, that wherever it is, whatever country they're working in. I think oftentimes the missing skill sets have to do with almost on a business level. How do you do things like establish key performance indicators, establish how you're going to assess progress, go through and know how to do large scale planning from a strategic level with large organizations or small organizations? How do you align current existing plans and missions with the need for digital access and the legal requirements that now exist? How do you do those things so that the entire organization can then be brought in together? Because it's collective. It's not something that just an IT department or just a web development team can be responsible for. It's an organization-wide opportunity, really.
Yeah.
And so I think oftentimes that's what's missing in terms of a skill set is how do you create like a roadmap for digital access within, especially if you're a disability professional who is working with individual organizations. Or agencies, that's oftentimes the skill set that's missing. And so providing professional development on how you do things like that. How do you develop those plans? How do you get buy-in? How do you determine which stakeholders need to be at the table within an organization so that they all have a voice, that we're including the voice of individuals with disabilities, and that we're taking that information and that data and using it in the most effective, efficient, and financially responsible way possible. I think that's oftentimes that's the skill sets that's missing. Usually there's a large amount of knowledge already in digital access and disability access and those legal pieces. What's missing is the application.
And it's understanding the business. Some of these accessibility specialists, I know some of our our colleagues and our members are alone or have very small teams in large organizations, and the toughest bit is that that burnout kind of aspect, and they say it takes 2 or 3 years to learn the business and learn who the right players are that I need to talk to build that out. So if you can try and encourage brown bag lunches, build up champions in your network, all those kinds of things to help you to be supported as you actually drive what these changes are, and then find out who makes the decisions on the strategies. And this is one that needs to be in there. There's a compliance aspect to it. So Susanna, what do you think? Your membership at IAP, what are they doing to kind of help build up the skill set for digital accessibility professionals? What would you like to see as well, maybe?
Well, I think what IWB has done during the last 10 years is really to make sure that we're moving from a grassroots movement to a real profession. And I think the professional certification is certainly helping, at least in the EU. We see much more procurement. So call for tenders are using IWP certification as an award criteria and so on, and also in recruitment advertising, they're asking for IWP certification. So I think that is kind of changing from just anyone being able to raise their hand saying, I'm an accessibility expert, to nowadays we can actually select who knows what they're talking about when they claim to be an accessibility expert. So I think that's very important, and IWP has been doing a good job and is still doing that, I think. What we should still do in IWP and the rest of the community is to make sure that there is also an professional education path. In IWP, we have seen the need for that and the demand for that specifically from our platinum members of really large organizations across the world with 40,000, 50,000 staff and so on, where there is, of course, a small proportion of the employees that are going to be or are already or will be accessibility professionals and certified and so on, but the vast majority just need to know the basics. And I still think that is not only what IWP should do, but also what the society needs is not only the experts, but really the kind of the broad knowledge of basic accessibility. So that is what we are now trying to develop, like training programs and professional education to support those members and others who are interested in kind of supporting staff members who are not going to be the accessibility expert per se, but needs to know something and just starting their accessibility journey via training and so on. So that I think is what is missing and what IWP can contribute to, but I'm sure also other organizations can contribute to as well.
And that
But
touches back
it's
onto
highly
the
needed.
education. Yeah, exactly. And it comes back to the education piece we've already talked about. So, and what about you, Alanna? What are you seeing as, the digital inclusion standard? There's an aspect there of education, a culture change, accessibility. And thank you for answering the questions about jurisdictions. I know that some of them do align with federal, and it's great to see federal keeping up that pace, so that those local jurisdictions, especially states, can actually, align again and update their alignment. But yeah, what are you seeing as training and aspects around accessibility and inclusion that need to happen in government?
So I think perhaps one of the most vocal groups when we were developing the service standard and the inclusion standard were the smaller agencies, because they're the ones that mostly don't have the larger resources and the accessibility specialists. And, in a perfect world, they would, but sadly, they just don't. So one of the main things they said was that they really want to do accessibility and inclusion well, but they just didn't know how. So one of the main things that came out of that for us was creating the digital accessibility toolkit, digital experience toolkit, but it has a big focus on accessibility. And we will be bolstering that with more guidance as we go along, and that will be built out in line with what agencies tell us that they need. But there has been an educational component there to a degree, particularly surrounding skills capability uplift, what it is that agencies need to consider and how this can be done. And there are a variety of resources out there as well. So we've been pointing agencies towards that within the standards as well.
Excellent, yeah, and we're also working with OZeWAI as an organisation of digital accessibility professionals, working with DPA and other state jurisdictions on those kind of advocacy aspects of toolkits and resources and things like that are community driven, and we really appreciate that we're involved in that, Alanna, and that we continue to be a part of the approach that government is taking. Look, we're coming up to 7 minutes left. Are there any final questions or any final notes or comments that you'd like to cover? And then I'm just going to finish up with a couple of OZeWAI items at the end. But Anne, what would you like to finish up with for our session today? And I really, really it has been wonderful just having this discussion with the three of you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me.
Final thought.
This is definitely the highlight of my day. I think if there was something I would leave individuals with, it's the concept that when working with organizations and agencies, sometimes the most important piece of information they need is that an individual is only responsible for their own content. Oftentimes it's overwhelming and you get pushback. And what I find to be sometimes the most effective is saying, one, there are resources, you will be supported. There are ways to do this. And at the end of the day, don't we already all work to create the best content possible? And if we've now learned that that content that we've worked so hard to create isn't accessible or isn't usable by the greatest number of people, then why wouldn't we want to update our practice so that what we work so hard to make, whether we do website development or whether we're in communications or marketing, or whether we're a professor or someone that's working in human resources, wouldn't we want to do everything within our power to make that usable by the greatest number of people possible? And if we think about the fact that we are only, as an individual, depending on your role, if you're a website developer, that's going to be a little different, but you're only responsible for your own content. And once people get that concept, all of a sudden, what they think is a mountain becomes a far more manageable request. And so that's one thing that I always try to help begin that perspective shift with, and that digital access is very possible. Many times it's the smaller things that actually give you the biggest wins. And it's something that can be achieved. And I think speaking that as a disability professional who gets to be a consultant and gets to work with these organizations, sometimes that carries more weight than an initial conversation about a legal standard. It's helping them understand that
it's little steps.
It's these little steps. And really getting to that point. And I think including it and incorporating it as an everyone opportunity as opposed to a quote unquote problem that one or two people need to now handle.
Yeah.
I think, I think that's really, if I was going to leave someone with something, it's that piece, that it is truly possible, and that we have an opportunity. And by simply changing perspective, we get so much more success and we create a much more sustainable experience, that truly does increase access for all. So that's
That's
what I would.
great. Thank you so much. Wonderful, wonderful final words there. And Susanna, what would you like to finish up with for people to take home, to take as
Yes,
takeaway?
I agree with Anne, but I also still remember some people who have started working in my organization and who said after kind of the onboarding plan saying, so if everything you say is true, why is this so fucking difficult? So, and I think we need to, I mean, I agree with all of you. We really should do, if we want to reach as many as possible, we should do this. But it's also crazy these days that it's so difficult to make a website
Yeah.
accessible. And it's so crazy, so difficult to make even a Word document or even a PDF accessible. So I think we should put the real challenge where the problem is, which is where the CMS developers and the content developers and so on is really, because it's not really the content creators who make the mistakes, and some of the developers and designers do, but I mean it's because their environment is crazy. They're not supported to do the right thing. They are that what is easy in what they learn to do is to do the wrong thing. If it was made easier to do the right thing, it was. So it's kind of we need to shift left the whole thing. But that said, I think there is so much opportunities today, so the technology makes it so much easier to do things that we really had to struggle with when I started doing this. And also the young generation makes me extremely happy because they think in general, I mean, I know I'm generalizing, but it's a big shift from when I was young, that young people today see inclusion and diversity as a very natural thing, and that you don't need to train them in thinking that okay, people are different and therefore we need to do this. So you just need to give them the tools, and I think that is such a big step forward.
I think it's a huge one too. And Alanna, some final words from you. Thanks so much, Susanna, for being here again.
So I think essentially, look, times are changing, which I think is fantastic. This the policy and standards that we have, they're a new addition, and I think the legislation that's coming into play as well. I think times are changing, and I think it's nice to see how far we've come, but also how far we have to go as well. But it's a journey, but we'll get there eventually.
That's great. And thank you to Alanna. I really appreciate it. And so just to finish up, we have our final session. We have another session similar to this next week. We have Daniel from the EDF, Susanna joining us next week, as well as Jim from ATOS, and Alanna's colleague Bronwyn to share with us as well some other points of view. And I do thank Ricky for moderating that one for next week as well. Look, thank you everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate it. We'll be getting this recording up onto our website as soon as possible. Please think about subscribing to OZeWAI at the moment. It's free to subscribe. Please consider joining. It's very cheap. It's $50 for an advocacy level. From next year, we may be starting to charge for some of these webinars, very cheap cost, but it'll be cheaper to join. That will help us to develop the environment. We want to get Auslan interpreters. We want to actually provide more facilities for our members as well. So yeah, please consider joining. Check out our resources on the website. Thank you, everyone, and all have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.